All right, once again, I'm Tom Fournier from the History Symposium, and it's my pleasure to welcome back Donald E. Graves to the session. Don Graves is a well-known Canadian military historian who's published his first work on a War of 1812 subject in the late 1970s, and since that time has brought out 5 books on 1812 topics, as well as 3 volumes of memoirs and edited a new edition of a classic history of the war. Don Graves has also produced 11 books or monographs on other topics of Canadian military history, ranging from 1690 to 1945. So, Don's back once again. This is the fourth episode of what is planned to be, I'm going to say, a substantial number of conversations rather than trying to put a number on it with Don. And we host it here on the History Symposium YouTube channel in a distinct playlist. So, welcome back, Don.
Good day.
All right, so today's subject is the American Army. One of our previous episodes, you had referenced a considerable amount of research that you had done on the American Army during the period of the War of 1812. So maybe we can delve into that and learn a whole lot more about the U.S. Army.
Well, I got into the U.S. Army topic deeply because I was writing a master's thesis on Joseph Wilcox and the Canadian Volunteers, who were a unit of the Army. And while I was doing my research, somebody sent me a copy from Heitman's Registry of Officers, which had Wilcox listed as having a commission. And I knew that once he was listed as having a federal commission, there had to be a record somewhere in Washington. So I contacted the National Archives, and yes, they had muster rolls, and they actually made copies of these. These were rolls, literally rolls, 8 feet long. They hung around my apartment for a year or so, and intrigued a succession of young women who wondered what kind of a person I was with handwritten rolls. Um, but there wasn't enough information. So rather uh, sadly, I, uh, I read the correspondence of the Secretary of War from 1811 to 1816. It's 66 reels of microfilm. Each reel is about 200, 300 uh, pages of, uh, of handwriting, and there were some bad writers in those days. But anyway, it took me about 4 months, kept me out of trouble. Uh, and I made copious notes. And then I wrote the thesis. I had a lot more background, and after that, I was my good friend Rene Chartrand and I were sitting around one night, probably drank too much wine, which was our usual uh, custom, and we got talking about the fact that in the Napoleonic period, every little European state, like the Grand Duchy of Fenwick, there's a pun there if you know it, uh, which had like 3 mounted lifeguards, 10 foot guards, and a band, has a book about them. All these little states, but there was nothing about the U.S. Army, a U.S. military establishment, and that was we felt was kind of uh, I know a subject that had been overlooked because the United States and the Ottoman Empire were the only two nations in the Western Hemisphere that had, for instance, ordnance casting capabilities, weapons manufacture, et cetera, et cetera. So we decided we'd write a book on the War of 1812 American Army, which we did. Rennie took uniforms, flags, small arms, and what else did you do? Yeah, I think that was a big chunk of it. I took the rest. I took history, organization, leadership, um, ordnance, um, doctrine, and unit histories. And we got this manuscript, and we actually sold it to an American. We didn't sell it. An American publisher was interested in it, but they wanted to do it in a typescript format, which we didn't like. We wanted to print, so it didn't get done. Rennie then took his part, and Hey, I have it right here. Nope, that's the back half of it. Where's the front? Hmm. Anyway, he published a book at Fort Niagara called Uniforms and Equipment of the War of 1812, which became a very popular book. And a few years ago, he brought out an updated version of that book. So that's the story of how we got into it. Now, to start topic of the American Army, um, a couple sessions ago, I talked about the background of the war, topography, population, climate, logistics, et cetera, et cetera. And I touched a bit upon the American Army. But I'll go back over this in detail. But basically, from 1783 and the conclusion of the Revolutionary War, right up until about 1807, there wasn't much of an American Army. I think in 1783, there was a company of regular infantry at West Point to guard stores. And there was all a prevailing distrust of regular troops, of uh, government troops, um, because it was equated with the British Army, which of course had been doing had to keep order. So the, most Americans didn't like the idea of a standing army. They preferred to put their faith in the militia, and that was the prevailing attitude in the United States. Well, almost until the Second World War, not the Second World War. I'm sorry, Civil War. So units would be raised, regular units would be raised as needed. They were needed in the late 1790s. Um, they were fighting the Indigenous Confederacy in the Northwest, and they raised what they called legions, sub-legions, which were interesting groups which consisted of a regiment of infantry, a couple of companies of cavalry, and a couple of companies of artillery, all three arms, little miniature divisions. But as soon as that crisis passed, they were disbanded.
So,
Now,
so that would be Anthony Wayne, I think one time, Harrison another time.
yeah, well, this was Anthony Wayne this time. They
Okay.
were disbanded, but they then raised another army with when the Quasi War with France was on. I'm not going to get into that. They on paper raised a number of regiments which were never actually raised, but there was an intent there to raise them. In 1802, by 1802, they had four regular infantry regiments and a regiment of artillerists, they called it, which manned the coastal emplacements, which were the main line of defense. And in 1802, the military academy at West Point was also established. Now, at this time, there was a lot of French officers in the American Army, in the engineer and artillery, which are fairly scientific corps. And a lot of of course, the direction of the training and the doctrine was towards French sources. Well, those officers were expunged when the Jefferson uh, government came in, and the Jeffersonian, the Republicans, which my grasp of American politics is sometimes very weak. But this is now the modern Democratic Party. Anyway, the Republicans, Democratic Republicans, do not believe in standing armies. They believe in militias. They do not really believe in standing navies, big warships. I mean, the Americans had several fine warships, and it actually fought a successful naval campaign or series of operations against the Barbary pirates um, across the Atlantic. But they mothballed most of those frigates and built a whole fleet of gunboats that would guard the harbors of the United States, which were practically useless. And they then, I think, reduced the army to two regiments. I may be wrong on that. Anyway, things went on, and then the Chesapeake crisis occurred in 1807. This happened when a British frigate, HMS Leopard, fired into stopped USS Chesapeake and demanded to board her because the captain of the Leopard had a reason to believe there were British deserters on board, which there probably were. Um, and the American captain refused, and so he fired into her, fired a broadside into the Chesapeake, which that's a no-no, and he was disciplined for it. But anyway, it caused, as you could imagine, a great fuss, and the Americans were, the United States was, rightfully so upset at this because the Chesapeake wasn't manned for action. Um, so they then raised the army to 7 infantry regiments. They had a regiment of artillerists. They raised a regiment of riflemen and a regiment of light dragoons. And in 1807, now things got tense as things got tense around 1810 and 11. And I'm not going to get into the details of it. I think we went into that before. But unfortunately, a regiment of light artillery, horse artillery. Well, they dismounted the regiment of horse artillery or light artillery to save funds. They also didn't really raise the regiment of riflemen fully, and they dismounted most of the regiment of light dragoons. So it really wasn't as effective as it might have been. But in 1811, we then have tensions on the Northwest, the old Northwest, Michigan, Ohio, etc. And this is when William Henry Harrison marches forth with the 4th United States Infantry, a regular regiment, and militia, and wins a victory over the indigenous people at Tippecanoe. It's interesting to note that the Treaty of Ghent, which brings an end to the War of 1812, Article 9 is interesting because it restores all the rights and privileges that the indigenous peoples had prior to November 1811, in other words, prior to the Battle of Tippecanoe. So in a way, you might say that the War of 1812 actually started in 1811, but that's just my theory. Anyway, this is towards the end of 1811, and over the winter, Madison's government decided that they would put the nation in arms and talked about raising an army. And in the spring, they sent out a call for 50,000 volunteers, which was very hardly, the response just wasn't good enough. You have to recall that the war, when it did come, was not popular in parts of the United States, especially the New England states. This was not a popular war. So when the volunteers ran short, they then belatedly turned to raising more regular units, and they raised units numbered 8 to 25. And these units fought the greater part of the War of 1812. But the thing was, they were recruiting just during the spring planting season. They were offering $8 a month pay, whereas a labor and agriculture labor could make $1 a day if he was good. So, who's going to join the army when you can make 4 or 5 times as much working on a farm? So the recruiting was very slow. When war was declared in June 1812, they had about 10,000 men under arms. So we'll go through that again. There's now infantry regiments numbered 1 to 25. They raised another regiment of light dragoons, so there's 2 regiments of light dragoons. They raised 2 regiments of artillery. So there's the regiment of artillerists became referred to as the 1st Artillery. There are 3 regiments of artillery, and a regiment of light artillery, and a regiment of riflemen. The problem is the 7 pre-war regular regiments, which were in service, 5 of them were in the Louisiana territories or adjacent to Louisiana territories. Now, if you're going to invade Canada, it's best to get your best troops, your best units on the border. Well, they did not do that. They only had the 4th United States Infantry uh, um, deployed on the border. The 1st United States Infantry was deployed along the length of the Mississippi. The regiments down in Louisiana stayed there throughout the whole war. The 5th and 6th were ordered to turn their companies over to the 3rd and 7th, and they went to New York and raised to the New York area and raised new units. So really, they're going to carry out an offensive war in a very difficult uh, area to campaign. I went into the details on that before against a professional enemy. There was probably around 10,000 men in uniform in the regular army at the outbreak of war. There were nearly 9,000 British regulars in British North America, backed up by a militia system, which is much more effective than the American system. So the war. What then happened was 1812 was a disaster for the American Army. They they started to recruit. Excuse me. They started to recruit, and a captain would go out with a drummer and fifer and a sergeant and patrol the taverns for fish, um, looking for gullible young men. And once he got a fair number, 50 or 75, he would march them to the regimental rendezvous. There were various places where the regiments rendezvous. Problem was, a lot of these recruits thought they were going to serve with that captain, who was a very smooth talker usually, and promised them all sorts of things they weren't going to get. And when they got to the rendezvous, they were mixed up and mixed in with other companies and other officers. This was a cause of much dissatisfaction. Um, but bit by bit, they gathered an army, and sent it marching to the north. Now, the summer of 1812, the the Americans um, the Americans attempted an invasion of Detroit, of the Detroit River, across the Detroit River, and that didn't last long. And then General Brock, the British General Brock, came down and launched an offensive across the river against Detroit. And the American general, I'm just trying to think of it, William Hull, whose nerves were pretty well gone, surrendered. Not only did he surrender his army, including the 4th United States Infantry, he surrendered the territory of Michigan to Brock. Brock hadn't asked him for that. So that was one disaster. Another disaster was not a disaster, but another defeat was at La Coal Mill. Dearborn, who was the senior general, marched across the border and put in an attack at La Coal Mill, but his half-trained troops just could not do anything. They had friendly fire problems, and they pulled back.
So if I can clarify for our viewers, that was an attack on Lower Canada. It's sort of on the outskirts of Montreal, right? Or
Yeah,
on the
about
approaches to Montreal.
100 miles from
Okay.
Montreal.
Yeah.
And so, two bad defeats. So you have to look at this army in the autumn of 1812. You've got senior leaders. Where are they going to get their generals from? Well, they had to haul out a lot of dugouts from the Revolutionary War. Hall, Dearborn was the senior general, and or they commissioned generals from the militia, and these men were not trained and not experienced. It was the middle uh, cadre, the majors to colonels, where the American Army really lacked, and which the British Army was uh, had the advantage. I mean, very few American officers of the field grade had the experience of men like Colonel Tom Pearson, who'd fought in Holland, Spain, Portugal, Egypt, and the West Indies over 14 years. This man was experienced. They could not match that expertise. The junior officers were basically whoever a Republican, Democrat congressman said was a good guy, they got a commission, and they had no training. And one would ask, what about the academy at West Point? Well, I think by 1812, it had graduated about 52, around 52, 53 officers. But West Point was designed to create and educate engineer and artillery officers, and most of these graduates, I think it was about 30 of the 52 who did go into the army, were in the artillery and engineers. And throughout the war, this has to be said, the artillery and engineers were the most professional arms of the American Army. So we got a real mess. It's the end of the year, and on top of this, Secretary of War William Eustis, um, I read his correspondence. This guy got lost in details. He wanted to control everything. He did not delegate. He had no idea of delegating. He concerned himself over the the well, over a couple of barrels full of uniform coats. Where were they? He had clerks who could do that. He would not delegate. He also, I understand, drank too much. Can't say much about that. But he was replaced at the end of this awful year by John Armstrong, who had served in the Continental Army and had been given a commission as general and then was made Secretary of War. Armstrong was a much different kettle of fish. He he had energy, he had intelligence. His one problem was, I think, if he said it, it was done. I mean, like he had ideas. He wrote a book called Hints from an Old Soldier to Young Generals, a little booklet. I've read it. Most of it is cribbed from European authors, and he later confessed he wrote it in 7 days, which tells you something right there. But he was always full of these, pincer movements and great strategy. But he did inject energy into the army, and at the beginning of 1813, things began to pick up. They began to get the arms, equipment, and uniform they needed. They also another. I'm not going to get into details, but they raised regiments numbered 26 to 42, 43. Although a lot of these regiments were only raised for a year, and very few of them saw heavy fighting. Now, the big problem was in 1812, the troops weren't well trained. And here there was a real problem. We have to go into some details. The drill book, the manual or the doctrine, source of doctrine, and it was infantry doctrine because the infantry was the major arm. The artillery and cavalry have to follow its movements. From 1778, the American Army Militia and Regular used a book written by Baron von Steuben, a German officer who joined American service. And notice I say Steuben, not Steuben. That's because I lived in Germany for a while, and that's the way it's pronounced properly. There you go. Picayune, eh? Anyway, Steuben wrote this little book, became called the Blue Book. What he did was he took the 1764 British Infantry Manual, which was wise because there were all kinds of copies of that manual in the 13 colonies. He took it, compressed it, and added onto it a whole section on practical like camp, how to bivouac, how to billet, how to camp, where to put the latrines, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it was, a very useful little little handbook. It only went up to the company level, I think, as I recall, in training. But and it was used in the American Army. The militia used it right up and through the war. The regular army used it right up until about 1806, 1807, when commentators had become knowledgeable about warfare in Europe, and they knew that the French army was moving away from a stiff linear doctrine into one which is more flexible. And they began to they realized the Steuben's Blue Book was getting dated and pushed for the American Army to adopt the 1791 Reglement of the French Army, which was the drill manual and the doctrinal manual of Napoleon, the Revolutionary and Napoleonic French armies. So translations were made, and one of the fellows most interested in this was William Duane, who was the publisher of the Philadelphia Aurora, and he was a stout, an Englishman by birth, by the way, but he was a stout member of the Republican Democratic Party, and he got interested in this and began to publish military treatises. One was called the American Military Library, and the other one was called American Military Dictionary. And one of these treatises, he had translated almost the entire 1791 reglement. But the War Office itself, the War Department, War Office, War Department, confuses sometimes with the British War Office. The War Department, Secretary of War, which was Henry Dearborn, by the way, at that time, commissioned its own translations of French manuals. And as war began to approach, nothing was done about this, but as war began to approach in 1811, 1812, they commissioned a Virginia militia officer, Colonel Alexander Smythe, to take these translations and prepare a manual for the regular army, which he did. And what he did was he took the 1791 reglement, compressed it very nicely down, putting only in it what was really needed. And to that he added Steuben's useful discussion of camps and marches, et cetera, et cetera. And this was the Smythe's regulations, which came out very, very good, very apt in April 1812, just before war broke out. And it was used by the regular army and all the new regiments up until January 1813, when Armstrong came into office. And Armstrong was a good friend of William Duane's, and he then chose William Duane's little primer called a Handbook for Infantry as the doctrinal manual for the Army. Problem was, this Handbook for Infantry really had nothing above the platoon level. It just a company level. It was really a primer. It was not nearly as good or extensive as Smythe. So you had the army on the northern frontier trying to puzzle out which manual to use, because most of the regular officers did not like Duane's handbook. They thought it was too useless for regular troops. So you have this great, what's the word, conflict going on between those who adhere to Duane, those who adhere to Smythe, those who adhere to Steuben. Some say, let's go back to Steuben. One regimental commander, was Ripley the 21st, used the British 1792 regulations to train his regiment. And one regimental commander showed a great initiative and compiled his own manual. So what you got is this army now of regiments being trained according to different manuals. There was never a lack of training. All the generals in the Northern Frontier in 1813 emphasized training. The problem was a regiment trained on Duane, a regiment trained on Smythe, and a regiment trained on Steuben could not maneuver together, could not maneuver, say, in a brigade formation. This was a problem, and it showed up throughout the year. So anyway, I won't get into the campaigns uh, that we which we'll be discussing at a later date. But 1813, by 1813, you could say that the American Army at the unit level was very good. They were certainly praised by their opponents. I mean, even an ogre like Tom Pearson, who was not sparing with his praise for anybody, said to an American officer one time just after the Battle of Kreiser's Farm, um, "Sir, your men are the bravest I've ever seen, but your officers know nothing of service," which is typical Pearson. It was a problem with the officers, but the officers were gaining experience. A lot of the fellows who'd been commissioned so fast previous year either quit the service or wiggled their way out of serving on the northern frontier. So by process of elimination, the officer corps is getting better and more experienced. But overall, 1813 was not a good year. Except for William Henry Harrison, who destroyed the Northwest Indigenous Confederation at the Battle of the Thames. Um, it was another year of defeats and retreats and withdrawals. So we come to 1814. Following the abortive offensive against Montreal, James Wilkinson, the senior general of the Army, took the army, which is a large army, 6,000 to 7,000 men, to a little town called French Mills, just on the other side of the border. It's about 15 miles from Cornwall, uh, and put them into winter camps there, put them into winter. And of course, most of the general officers and many of the regimental commanders then took leave to go south. The only general officer who stayed with the troops that winter, the whole winter, was Brigadier General Jacob Brown. And I want to talk a bit about Brown. Brown was an entrepreneur and a settler from Jefferson County, New York. He was involved in potash sales. Potash was a ready crop because our ancestors chopped down every tree they could and burned a lot of it, got potash. And he was a big potash salesman. He dealt in land sales and purchases. And he was also active in the militia. And by the outbreak of the war, he was a brigadier general in the New York militia. He performed very well. There was an abortive British attack on Ogdensburg, and he was there and he rebuffed it. And he rebuffed, well, more or less rebuffed, a British attack on Sackett's Harbor in May 1813. And Sackett's Harbor was an important naval base for the U.S. Well, after that, he looked like a bright light, so they commissioned him in the regular army as a brigadier general. He stayed with the troops. In February 1814, Armstrong ordered the cantonment at French Mills broken up. Half the army was to march to Plattsburgh, and half the army was to march to Sackett's Harbor. Brown was promoted to major general and given command of that portion of the army that marched to Sackett's Harbor. I should give you a little anecdote. The border is the border is so porous. An American friend of mine went down to French Mills. It's called Fort Covington today. It's named after Brigadier General Leonard Covington, who was killed at the Battle of Kreiser's Farm. Anyway, we wanted to scope it out, and we had a map of the camp of 1813-14 winter of, and we were driving around and we driving around. We sort of went out of the village, went up a ways, we crossed into Canada. We didn't know it. We we we, we passed this single story building on the left with a flag, nothing else, and we said, "Good God, we're in Canada. We've got to get out of here. We go back home." You're his home anyway. So we drove back, and then we saw that this building was a U.S. Customs post. So we stopped and got out, and there was nobody was at Dutch door. There was nobody at Dutch door, but we could hear the TV. This is a Sunday afternoon. We could hear a football game at the TV, and finally we kind of said hello. And this this U.S. Customs border officer came out and clearly annoyed because he was watching a football game. He said, "Right." They said, "Well, we went out of the country by mistake. We're trying to just go back in." He said, "Well, what nationality are you?" And my friend said, "I'm American." And I said, "I'm a Canadian." And he said, "Well, how did you two meet each other?" So we got into this long story, and he said, "It's okay, go." You know, we went back to the football game, and we went back to the United States. But so we're now here in February 1814, and Brown has got what was the left division, and Izzard, Major General Izzard, had the right division, Plattsburgh and Lake Champlain. Brown had the left division at Sackett's Harbor. They're called left and right from the way they face on the map. If you're going north, the westernmost division is left and easternmost is the right. By the way, the British had the exact opposite. The
Yeah.
British right division was opposed to the American left, and the British left division was opposed to the American right. It's confusing. The United States was divided into military districts, and the biggest of these, and it was huge, went from Lake Champlain to the Detroit River. And this is military district number 9. And this was the left and right division of military district number 9. Anyway, Brown received, there was a rather confusing series of orders, but eventually he moved to Buffalo. And there uh, he had his division. He got there 10 weeks, about 2 months. And Buffalo, of course, had been more or less burned to the ground previous winter by the British in retaliation for the burning of Newark or Niagara on the Lake. And as drummer Jarvis Hanks, the 14-year-old drummer boy whose memoir I edited for publication, said, "It's this burned out, a collection of chimneys was all that was left in it. It really, really made the troops mad." So Brown established a camp at Williamsville, just outside the village. Brown was then called back to Sackett's Harbor, and he left the camp in the hands of Brigadier General Winfield Scott. Well, that's the name. That's the name we are all familiar with. Winfield Scott was one very aggressive, very professional officer. He was 6'4", and there's a lot of stories about his height, etc. Anyway, Scott established a training camp, and he began to put the regular troops through 10 weeks of intensive drill. Now, he had to solve this manual problem, and he said, he says in his memoir, he wrote the most self-serving memoirs I have ever read. You can hardly trust anything in that he says, except maybe the dates. Maybe he got the dates right. I don't know. but he says he trained him on a manual of his own composition. Right. Well, the daily orders for that camp are in the New York State Archives in Albany, and I read them and made notes. And right there it says the manual to be used for the training of the troops is Smythe's regulations. Boom, there it is. So, you can't trust Scott. Anyway, he got them up to the unit level, and then he began probably using the French 1791 reglement to train them at the brigade level. And this, they could now maneuver as a brigade. And his brigade was the 11th, 9th, 11th, 22nd later, and 25th. The other brigade consisted of the 21st, which was was one of the best regiments in the army, the 23rd, and I'm not sure later the first. So there were two brigades, two regular brigades, one commanded by Scott, one commanded by Eleazar Ripley, and a third brigade then arrived, and it consisted of militia and volunteers. It had a regiment from Pennsylvania and a regiment from New York. And the regiment from New York had started out as militia, but they were told that there was a chance they'd be seeing action in Canada. Well, according to the law, they did not have to go outside the state. So Porter was the commander, Peter Porter. He was smart. He lined up the regiment on one side of a road, and he went up and down the road with his officers on horseback and exhorted the men to be brave patriots, told them they'd get extra pay, extra food, etc. All you have to do is volunteer, and you can start by crossing the road. You know, it it it, it has it has tones of Travis's fairly popular act of drawing the line at the Alamo. And anyway, one or two went across, and the officers and who's going to join these brave men? Who's going to join these brave men? It took them hours. When the end, 90% of the regiment volunteered. The other 10%, he just said, "You garrison Buffalo." So this is how he got two large regiments of volunteers, and he also had that uh, that collection of near do wells and what have you, scumbags, and I don't know. Got to think of.
Is this Wilcox volunteers?
I don't want. I'm not prejudiced or anything. I know more about them than most people. I've been following them for 50 years. No kidding. Uh, and so he had Wilcox's volunteers, and he had a company of New York cavalry. So this, what's coming together here in Williamsville is probably the first organized field formation in the War of 1812 on either side. Okay. The British had divisions, but they weren't field formations. They were administrative districts, and they would just scrape up when they had to get a force together. They'd scrape up infantry, cavalry. They didn't train together as a formation. The left division did. So what you've got here is a force of three arms, about 5,000 men, most of whom are trained. At least 2/3 are well trained. And you've got Brown. He's got a staff of regular officers, good regular officers. You've got two brigades of regulars and a brigade of volunteers. But more than that, you've got an actual engineer department. And there was a demonstration unit at West Point called the Company of Sappers and Miners. The cadets would have to go out and survey fortifications and build fortifications. And these guys would actually build the fortification. Well, they brought it up from West Point. So you've got engineer officers in a small engineer unit. Then you've got a company of regular light dragoons and a company of volunteer dragoons. And finally, you've got four, I'm going to use the term batteries, although they weren't, that term was not used the same way as it is today. But you have four batteries of artillery. Two are field batteries, 6-pounder guns and 5.5-inch howitzers. One is a medium battery with 12-pounder guns, and one is a heavy battery with 18-pounder guns. 18-pounder guns. You have here a division, okay? I can't say more. Um, so on the 3rd of July, this division invades Canada. I think did we talk about Scott jumping off the boat?
Yes. I had misportrayed it as Smythe, and you corrected me. You said it was Scott. Yeah.
Did we record that though? I don't.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's on one of the earlier episodes, so yeah.
Scott went for a dunk, but he got ashore okay. Um, 3rd of July, that starts the Niagara campaign of 1814, and we're going to go into this campaign in greater detail. And that campaign lasted till the 5th of November, when the last of the American troops withdrew across the river to New York State, New York State. It was the longest and bloodiest military campaign of the War of 1812. And, you know, I have to say, a British officer who came to Canada after the war, he was sent over by the Duke of Wellington to sort of survey what was needed in the way of defense works. And he wrote a report. I think his name was Smith Carmichael. Don't quote me on that. He wrote a report, and he said in that report, it was really, it was really amazing. How did he put it? It was amazing how professional the American Army became in the last year of the war. And you know, he's right. My nickname for the Northern Army is Bootstrap Army because they had to learn it all by their bootstraps, uh, their own efforts.
So, what legacy did the War of 1812 create for the American Army?
Well, no, hang on.
All
I
right.
want to just get a bit into the Battle of Chippewa. So the Brown crosses the river on the 3rd of July. On the 5th of July, they fight the Battle of Chippewa. And there, you know, the British are at the north end of the field, and Scott deploys his brigade, comes over the bridge, deploys from column into line, all the while under artillery fire. When the British General Ryle first sees him coming, he sees the gray uniforms. I should note that Scott's brigade were wearing gray jackets. And he says something to the effect that these are Buffalo militia. And uh, as they come across that little bridge and then deploy under British artillery fire without breaking, he is said to have exclaimed, "We don't have an eyewitness on this. Why, those are regulars, by God." And that's been picked up. And there's the famous painting by A.C. McBaron of the thin gray line.
Mhm.
I don't know if he said that, but knowing Ryle, and he was an Irishman and given to yeah, he had a fiery temper. It sounds like something he could have said. Now we'll go back to the legacy. I I don't know if you watched the military parade in Washington last summer.
I've seen clips of it, excerpts from it. Yes.
I found it interesting, and I may be mistaken on this. Maybe I got up from my chair and went to get another beer, but the commentator went from the Continental Army to the American Civil War. He didn't make any mention of the Army of the War of 1812 or the Army of Mexico. I don't know why. I sort of know why, but this is a legacy, and still today, when American writers, historians write about the War of 1812, it's always New Orleans or not Bladensburg, Baltimore, bombardment of Fort McHenry, and the frigate actions, the single ship victories. Well, the fact of the matter is that in June 1814, 66%, almost exactly, of the regular army was either on the northern border or marching towards the northern border. There's a statement of troops in the American State Papers, Military Affairs, that exact amount. These men are forgotten or ignored, and I know why, because they didn't get these great victories. It was they weren't at buckskin clad Tennessee riflemen shooting down those stupid British regulars who march up, march up. This, I've, this is such crap. If you look at the casualty figures for the American Army at New Orleans on the 8th of January, those units that had the highest casualty figures were the ones who advanced against the breastwork where there was artillery. It was artillery did the killing, not Tennessee riflemen, et cetera, et cetera. Oh well. Anyway, we'll go on here. I digress. I digress a lot. The legacy was this. Um, After the War of 1812, there was a larger army in existence all the time. There was a realization that regular troops, you had to have regular troops. You couldn't depend on the militia. We're not going to talk about it. There were many bloops and goofs when they called out the militia to do duty. Um, so, so there was a larger army. There was they put what you would call created specialty schools for artillery officers and engineer officers beyond their basic education at West Point. But most of all, they had officers who had been and seen and done it, and they dominated that army. There was almost I would call it a Niagara Mafia, officers of the left division who went on to greater things like Ripley. William Jenkins Worth was an aide de camp to Scott. He had a stint at West Point, and he ended up as a divisional commander in Mexico. Zachary Taylor had fought on the Mississippi. He ended up as an army commander in Mexico in 46, 47. Oh, Thomas Sidney Jessup had commanded the 25th Infantry in 1814. He became quartermaster general of the army, and he was still in service in 1861. You know, I think he had the longest service of any American officer. I think that he holds the record. And there are many, many others. And of course, there's Winfield Scott, who became a senior general of the army. Didn't have a commander in chief. They had a senior general, and he had his. Scott was he was oversized both physically. He was oversized in his abilities, and he was oversized in his faults. He was an extremely jealous man. He was above everybody, both physically and in every other way. And unless you kowtowed to him, he didn't like you. So he caused some problems. Uh, uh, he spent a lot of the time after the war. His wife, he married. His wife spent a lot of her time in Europe. And I know why. I guess why. He married into money, which is a good thing for an officer to do. But she spent a lot of her time in France and fashions and things. So he had a lot of spare time in his hands. He uh, he devoted it to translating the current French Army manual. So a new manual would come out in France, Scott would translate it, and then he would bring it out as Scott's infantry tactics. They were actually not really his tactics, they were the French tactics. At one point, he got tired of translating and he suggested that why don't we just take the French manual and train the troops using French words of command? Uh, true, it's true story. It's rightful rival. These two guys hated each other. Gaines, who was another general, is said to have remarked, "I think the English language is sufficient for any idea that General Scott might have." Can you can you imagine the American army fighting Apaches on the plains, shouting orders at each other in bad French? It's
Tiré, tiré.
yeah. Oh, he was something else. I'll give you another anecdote. When he was the senior general in Washington, of course, Washington hostesses had to invite him, and Scott considered himself a real gourmand, a gourmet. He knew how food was to be cooked. He liked food to be cooked. He got to about 300 pounds, you know. Anyway, Washington hostesses would have to invite him for uh, formal dinners because you had to do it. And he would always find something wrong with this fish hasn't been cooked enough or whatever. And it's vocal in his criticism. So the only one, the only belle of the balls uh, hostess was Verena Davis, who was the wife of Jefferson Davis, who was at that time the Secretary of War. She had to stage a formal dinner, but she went and got hold of Scott's cook, his personal chef, and asked him to come. One of Scott's favorite dishes was terrapin soup, turtle soup. Asked him to come to her house and prepare soup, this soup. Okay, so anyway, they all sit down and the soup is served, and Scott takes a spoonful and he says, "Too salty, ma'am, too salty." And of course, Verena Davis leans over her best Southern belle. "Why, General Scott, I'm surprised you should say such a thing, for you know I had your very own chef, whatever his name was, come over and prepare this." And Scott was he put down his spoon and he sat and glowered, didn't say a word for the rest of the dinner. That's one of the few women who got Winfield Scott. Uh, yeah. No, Scott, to come back to the uh, leadership in Mexico, the American Army, regular Army, performed very well, and uh, but
Yeah.
here you got divisional commanders, as I said, like William Worth, um, Zachary Taylor, two more. Oh, hello. The point is, there were younger officers there who learned their trade from these guys. Younger officers like Sherman, Grant, Jackson, and
Robert E. Lee. Oh, yeah.
yeah, through his entire military career up to Civil War, Lee served with or under veterans of the War of 1812. So that's a legacy right there, but it's not being stated. I I've talked to a number of American historians about covering this gap between 1814 and 1846. They don't seem interested. I don't know. Maybe it'll happen because after all, you can't have a Canadian telling you what to do. Yeah. If you
All
have
right.
you have more questions. I can see it.
Just as we wrap this up, I'm wondering about the soldiers themselves, comparative, the British versus the Americans. I think it came from some of the Snake Hill studies, like height, weight, overall health of an American soldier versus a British. What was that like?
Well, you know that they were taller. The average height of an American soldier was 5'8". The average height of a Canadian fencible was 5'8". The average height of a British soldier was 5'6". And that's because so many of the British soldiers were recruited from the slums of England. Uh, the major difference is you could take a Canadian soldier and an American soldier, give him an axe and a musket, and he could get his own food and provide his own shelter. The British soldier couldn't do that. He had to be looked after. He was great in action, but he couldn't provide himself, cook his own food, or make a shelter. He had to be looked after. So that's the major difference. In terms of discipline, the British Army was very hard. We know. Um, Discipline in the American Army was not as hard, but it was still hard. They had flogging in the American Army until right before the War of 1812. They abolished it uh, as an incentive to recruiting. But they came up with punishments which are almost destructive to your health, and I won't get into them. Um,
Education, comparatively.
you don't talk about education these days like that. It's not you had public school, high school, and university. If they could read and write, they were a rarity. I'm talking about the enlisted men. Officers
Yes.
had to be able to read and write. Sergeants had to be able to read and write. But other than that, very few. Well, there did be some, but most of them were functionally illiterate. I can't say there'd be that much difference between a Canadian and an American. There'd be a difference between a Brit and an American. I should mention that right throughout the war, there was a constant traffic going both ways of deserters. Desertion at that time wasn't the sin that is now regarded as. It was, um, as I said earlier, being recruited was many men took it as a personal commitment on the part of the officer to look after them. And when the officer was changed, you got new officers he didn't like. He said, "To hell with this." A soldier's life was hard. To hell with this. I'm going across the border, and it was going the other way. I think I've got the figures here somewhere, but 1,200 British soldiers deserted during the war, and 10% of the American army, which by 1814 had reached 45, 55,000, is supposed to have deserted during the war. That's a constant strain.
But desertion didn't necessarily mean you crossed over to the enemy. It could just mean you disappeared, right? You failed to turn up
Yeah,
at roll call and
yeah. But on the Niagara, once you crossed the river, either way, you were going to fall in with the military, and yeah, the, I mean, it was a problem in Spain. Desertion was a problem with Wellington's army in Spain, and but they were Wellington's army was pretty well policed, much more stiffly policed than the British Army in Canada. One problem is the sheer distances, the woods, you know, and it was always indigenous people. You could run away and join them. You had a free lifestyle. I don't know.
well, and then culturally and especially linguistically, language-wise, right? There was no barrier that way. You could, if you're a Brit, you could cross over into the US and just easily assimilate.
Make yourself understood, and there was employment because with all these people going to the army, you could get a job as a farmhand. You could make a start, and same the other way, you know. So I don't think there's much difference between a Canadian and American soldier. There was a difference between the British and the American soldier. After the war, they tried to settle many British veterans on land in Upper Canada. They tried to form almost military colonies, and it didn't work. They found that the best were the Scots. That they were the best. They would work hard, get farm going. The Irish weren't so good. They would drift in and work as uh, well. The Rideau Canal, there was hundreds of them employed. The English not so good. They usually drifted in and found jobs at the lower level of the bureaucracy, et cetera, et cetera. That yeah. What else do you want to ask me about the
I think that covers a lot of it. And just an aside, it might have very well been your book. You talked about the Americans and Canadians could fend for themselves, but something that comes to mind was the siege of Fort Erie. And they talked about, because it was, getting into the fall, you get a sense of pervasive rain. And they talked about the Canadian militia had these elaborate lean-tos and shelters. They were doing fine. And
oh
they're
yeah,
talking about the British, how pathetic they were, and how much these guys were suffering there. So,
rolling up a blanket with your musket and
yeah.
yeah, and it was pointed out, I think it was William Dunlop, Surgeon Dunlop, a very acute observer. He said that the Canadian militia, the Canadian troops, there weren't that many militia for you, and the Watteville's regiment, the so-called Swiss regiment, was actually it was whatever you had, it was that regiment. But they were European campaign veterans, and they could make a shelter out of whatever they had, and they could actually go and pick herbs and shrubs and make wonderful soup. They didn't suffer either.
Yeah, I think it's Siege of Fort Meigs. It might have been in Byfield's account, or maybe Richardson's, but they talk about the soldiers were so useless. They were peeling bark off of trees and then trying to use that as blankets, to shelter from the rain and cold. So,
Yeah.
uh, all right. Well, next time I think we're going to talk about the British Army and the Canadian militia. So give them a similar treatment. So thank you for this, Don. Really enjoy it. Really come
Just
to look forward to these sessions with you.